Hello and welcome back to the KCC channel. I'm Rob and I hope you're having a wonderful day today. Today we're jumping into some malicious compliance. Our first story today comes to us from Tapioca Fumble. Work on this music knowing there will be many problems down the road. Okay, let's jump right in. First time posting here and on Reddit, so I apologize if I'm not organizing this as thoroughly as all the awesome posts here. I am an audio engineer. Around 5 years ago, I was working at a very high-end facility with some amazing equipment. The studio looked beautiful. It was quite amazing. Most of my time at the studio was spent recording musical artists and mixing their tracks. I was booked for an 8-hour block to mix some pre-recorded tracks that a producer was going to bring in. To clarify, mixing a song means taking all the individual instrument recordings and balancing volumes and applying effects. After a song is mixed, it's sent to a mastering engineer who puts the final touches on it and makes it ready for distribution. In most cases, especially if it's through a record label, the mixing engineer and mastering engineer are two different people, since they're two different art forms that utilize different technologies. I like to research my clients before they come in, so I did some poking around on the internet and found out very quickly that the producer coming into the studio is a very accomplished producer who has worked with some amazing artists. I was thrilled. I hadn't worked with a producer of this caliber before. We'll call him the producer. I made sure to get as much information as possible from the studio manager so that I could come into the session well prepared. My manager forwarded me an email from the producer that said they were just mixing a few songs. I asked if I was getting an assistant engineer to help. My manager told me that they actually requested that I don't have an assistant. This was a first, but I shrugged it off. I got to the studio early and prepped for as much as I possibly could. The producer and the band that he recorded arrived, so I started getting files and such from them to start mixing. As I'm doing this, I started to see a lot of red flags. The producer brought in 10 songs that he needed mixed and mastered today. Typically, I'll mix 2 songs in 10 hours, maybe 3 if I'm hauling and not taking ear breaks and such. Furthermore, he wanted it to be mixed on our large recording console, the giant desk with all the buttons and faders and such, essentially bypassing the computer. I let him know the following. 1. Mixing 10 songs in 8 hours is going to be very difficult, and that I'll have to sacrifice quality moving that quickly, and that I'll do my best to mix the songs all in one day. 2. I'm not a mastering engineer, but I have experience mastering and can give them some masters that will suffice. I'll provide files they can send to other mastering engineers as well. 3. Mixing on a console instead of a computer means that it will be way more time consuming, since I would be turning physical knobs, pushing physical buttons, and connecting gear with cables, and keeping track of all of this. It also means that if they want any edits or changes after today, they'll need to book the studio for at least 2 to 3 additional hours so that I can set everything up again exactly how it was. I figured that since the producer had worked with such amazing artists before, all of this would make sense to him. I got the impression that he either didn't care or more likely didn't realize. He was very nice, but quite dismissive, and essentially told me to mix it on the console. To add to my stress, I started finding all sorts of mistakes and issues in the recording that would take more time to address. Despite this, we worked really well together. I felt I gave him more than enough information about my concerns, so I complied with his requests, knowing full well that we were going to face a plethora of problems down the road. I got to work as fast as I could. The producer was quite eccentric, but we got along nicely and he was thrilled with some of the tricks I was pulling out of my hat to address all these issues. At the end of every mix, I'd take copious notes on what physical buttons were pushed, what cables were connected to what, etc. I did this for every client I've worked with, just in case they ever wanted to come back and make edits to their records. Normally, I'll have my assistant or intern do this, but they specifically asked not to have an assistant or intern around. I was able to get through each of the songs somehow. I was honestly impressed with myself. The songs sounded good, but not good, as I didn't have enough time to make them good. They were happy with the mixes. The producer seemed quite surprised that they sounded the way they did, so I took that as a compliment. We ended on a good note, so I thought that was the end of that. A few days later, I get booked again for 2 hours. We normally don't book 2-hour blocks, it's just not worth it. However, I agreed to the 2-hour because there was another 8-hour session booked directly after, so it worked out perfectly. The studio manager didn't quite understand what I'd be doing in those 2 hours. The client was very vague and would not answer any of our questions about what they wanted to happen in those 2 hours. I show up for the session, and the producer from a few days before was there. Before I can even say hello, a car that costs more than what I make in 2 years comes whipping through the parking lot. This guy jumps out and begins barking orders at me. I put together that this must be the executive producer. For background, an executive producer is essentially the guy that knows nothing about the process but has the money to fund it. It's a fancy name for the person who pays for everything. As he's barking orders at me, about 10 more ridiculously expensive cars pull in. I learned that the executive producer brought possible investors for his new record label into the studio to listen to the mixes and watch the executive producer manage a production team. After the executive producer greeted all his investors, he instructed everyone to go into the studio. I tried to get him alone to talk to him before, but he responded with, "I'm gonna do all the talking, you're going to do the work." He clearly wanted everybody to see how good he was at managing a production and such. He asked me to pull up the first song to play for his investors. I told him that if he wants to make any changes to the songs, I need at least 2 to 3 hours to set everything up before we can make changes. I told him I could play the songs for his investors, but I can't make any changes unless I take the 2 to 3 hours to set it up. I also said that I can't even do that today, since I have another client coming in 2 hours. As I'm saying this, I see the producer behind him smiling, clearly getting a lot of satisfaction from this. The executive producer literally turned red with anger and started yelling. I honestly couldn't understand half of what he said. When the executive producer stopped yelling, the producer cutely said, "I told you so." That's when I realized that the producer had actually been the one who maliciously complied with the executive producer to some degree. This is my favorite part. The executive producer handed me a $100 bill and said something like, "You have 10 minutes to set it up." He did this in front of his investors. I'm not sure what he was thinking would happen. Some of them literally laughed out loud and walked out. I was sick of it, so I maliciously complied, knowing that I could never set it up on time, making the executive producer look bad in front of his investors. So I started setting it up anyway. I didn't take the $100. As I was setting it up, one of the investors came up to me and asked if I was actually able to set it up in 10 minutes. I told him it wasn't possible, so he turned around and walked out. About 10 minutes later, they all left because I didn't have anything set up yet. Later that week, the producer came back to work with me some more. We had a great working relationship from that point on. I talked with the producer about this whole thing, and he said that the executive producer hired him to help get his record label off the ground. The executive producer apparently didn't listen to anything the producer advised him on and treated him very poorly. So the producer decided to just comply with whatever executive producer wanted, knowing full well it wouldn't work out. He got sick of the executive producer's antics and just wanted out. The producer had informed the executive producer about everything that would go wrong before they booked me for the mix, and the executive producer completely disregarded him. The producer told me that the executive producer didn't want an intern or an assistant at the studio for the mix because he only wanted high-end music production people there. If assistant is in their title, they don't deserve to be there. It turns out that all the investors pulled out and the band started to sue the executive producer for copyright infringement. That's a separate issue that I have no info on. I absolutely love how this story was double malicious compliance. One by the producer over the executive producer for just doing everything that the executive producer said and not telling them any of the realities of life. And second by OP for just following the instructions to go in and set up the equipment, knowing full well it wouldn't be done anywhere near in time. Wonderful work from both parties. Do me a quick favor, have a look down below the video. If that subscribe button's still red, it means you're not actually subscribed to the KCC channel. Please hit that subscribe button for more daily Reddit stories. Our next story today comes to us from Mode Dib of Ericus. Just write exactly what I say. Let's jump right in. A few years ago, I spent the summer at Grandma's house. It was reasonably fun overall, painting with my aunt and grandma and going to the beach, but there were, and still are, moments where my grandma can be difficult to wrangle. I love her nevertheless, which is why I'm happy this ended with laughter. At one point, she asked me to transcribe an email for her, so I sat down to type. She started talking until she misspoke a word. I believe she said beluga when she meant Bellagio. Well, Grandma didn't appreciate my correction and, quite crossly, insisted I copy her words down exactly and refrain from editorial remarks. I shrugged and continued typing. About halfway through, her dog grabs one of her shoes and thus begins about 10 minutes of cursing, pleading, and pulling as she tries to retrieve her beloved Birkenstocks. I gleefully typed all this out, and soon enough, the whole matter was done with when the dog fell asleep. Grandma resumed her train of thought, finished the email, and told me to hit send. Grandma, are you sure? Yes, Paul, I'm quite sure. Now please send the email. I shrugged and complied. Later in the day, she got an interesting response from her friend, showed it to me, and I told her what she told me, to type out exactly what she said. Nothing was said about not typing the profanity. We all had a good chuckle after she clarified the situation with her friend. Well, I have to say in the end that I'm glad that Grandma had a good sense of humor, because if that would have been me, I might have throttled that little craphead for putting those in there. Our next story today comes to us from Dramanite. HOA didn't like the 3 inches of our tree on the sidewalk. Let's jump right in. I was living with my parents temporarily and came home to my dad bitterly putting on his jacket and boots. He's not the type to express his frustration, so I asked what's going on. Apparently the HOA, who has only sent us a letter once in the 12 years we lived here, sent one today nitpicking our yard. Our Christmas tree was 3 inches on the sidewalk and was a hazard to pedestrians' walking space, and didn't align with the tree maintenance code that doesn't allow overgrowth onto streets or sidewalks unless 8 feet tall. This also affected the tree across from the Christmas tree, since that thick branch you can see cut out was 7.8 feet tall over the sidewalk. There were a few other nitpicky things, but the letter at the end was like, you have a week to fix this or you'll be charged $50 a day till it's fixed. We recently got a new head of the HOA who's pew-pew happy to fix the neighborhood, since the old HOA president was pretty laid back during their last years. The letter was pretty passive-aggressive too, with specific measurements, direct quotes from the code, and a speak about keeping the neighborhood nice. I think my dad was even more mad because he's been working on the yard all week to make it nice for the winter and had just the Christmas tree left. So he told me, well, if they want it done that fast and are going to be hounding me the moment it's overgrown, then I don't want to risk it becoming a problem over the winter, which resulted in the image you see here. We measured the overhang, it's 8.3 feet. In his words, it ain't pretty, but it's within code. No expected rebuttal from HOA, as they haven't sent another letter, and this was 3 weeks ago. My dad's only concern is the tree having a dead patch, but he's been meaning to get different trees since that one is coming close to being as tall as our house, and it's too much upkeep for him and his full-time job. Plus, he's getting a bit older, which makes the outdoor work harder for him now. Judging by the photo, I can see how it would be a bit of a pain in the butt to walk down that sidewalk and have this tree hitting you in the shoulder. So trimming it back, I don't see that as being such a big deal. I'd love to hear your comments down below though. Do you think that the HOA was pushing it a little too far, or do you think that their request made sense? Which I kinda do. Anyway, let me know, comment down below. Our last story today comes to us from RB Clark 47. New manager consolidates meetings to waste our time and consistently loses docs for sign-off. So I use the meeting time to get him to sign documents. Let's jump right in. Fred was my new suited-up boss from IBM, hired to oversee 3 groups. I headed one, the IT group. In addition to IT, I had to handle all the hardware, software, and maintenance paperwork for all 3 groups. Fred started by having one 1-hour weekly meeting with each group, but after a month consolidated them into a 3+ hour meeting. He insisted each person give a weekly summary going around the table. 30+ people, half the worker bees went zombie after their turn. Fred became the black hole for signing off my paperwork, claiming I'd never given something to him. It would surface much later from a pile on his desk, usually a day or so before a contract was due or quote was going to expire. This put me at odds with the other group managers from time to time. So started sitting near the end at the meetings and bring all the paperwork I needed to work on. At my turn, I'd spend my first 5 minutes briefly explaining each document as I'd pass it to him, and the other managers would mark it on their meeting notes if it applied to them. Best use of my time. He couldn't weasel out and blame me, and the other managers would ask him the next meeting if he had signed off on XYZ. Got to the point where he'd just sign it and pass it back to me. Fred complained to me that I was being disrespectful to him, and it reflected in my pay non-raise that year. It was worth it. I ended up saving so much time. I earned the respect of all the other employees under him, and he only lasted a year before moving on anyway. Oh, that mentality, I just love it. Oh, you're being disrespectful to me because you're pointing out that I'm not pulling my weight. Yeah, boss man, respect is earned by doing your job on time and not blaming other people for your mess ups. Check out all 4 OPs linked in the description down below. I thank you for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you tomorrow.